Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm George Jackson, Vice President of Events at GovExec, and your host for today's program, Modernizing Agency Operations, Key Areas for Success, sponsored by Gordian and produced by GovExec. The Biden administration's recent initiatives regarding small business engagement, budgetary controls, metrics, and tracking are really important to public sector procurement professionals. I practiced that a few times, and their industry partners. The acquisition landscape has become highly technical as organizations seek a more seamless future. We've convened a great group of experts today to discuss some of the challenges and keys to success, starting with Tracy Marcinowski, the Assistant Commissioner for Acquisitions at PBS, the Public Building Service inside the General Services Administration. Tracy, welcome. Great to see you.
Thanks, George. Glad to be here.
Also, Nate Tranquil, the Assistant Director at the Government Accountability Office, one of my favorite federal agencies. Nate, welcome.
Thank you, George.
And last but not least, Lisa Cooley. She's Vice President of Federal at Gordian. Thanks for being here, Lisa. So let's kick things off, folks. Nate, you put together a really great report recently. GAO issued it last summer. It examines what tools industry and government procurement professionals are using to measure and improve performance. I know GAO reports can go into the hundreds of pages, so give us maybe an executive summary here.
Sure, absolutely, George. I can give you a quick 3-minute overview. So this is something we do at GAO from time to time. When we look at federal agencies, look at certain issues, activities, and we see everybody kind of doing things the same way, we like to go outside the federal government and see how private industry is approaching similar issues. So that's what we did with this job. And we were really homing in on contracting leaders and how they manage their subordinate organizations. And so we went out to 7 Fortune 100 companies, spoke to the folks who were equivalent to, say, senior procurement executives, heads of contracting activity, those folks, and talked to them about how they manage their subordinate offices, what was really important to them. And we went to a variety of companies, ExxonMobil, AT&T, Facebook, Kroger. We wanted to get a wide range of companies to A, try to help reflect the fact that the federal government buys tons of different types of products and services, right? And then B, find some commonalities across them, increasing the likelihood they would be applicable to federal agencies, right? So, just want to focus on what the grocery industry is doing or something like that. We wanted to take a broader cut at it. So we went out, we spoke to these individuals, and we found that they all adhered to 3 key practices, and they all were centered around performance metrics. The first one was that they all linked their procurement shops, their contracting shops, performance metrics to their company's strategic goals very clearly to help keep their teams in line with the overarching efforts. So that was practice 1. Practice 2, when they were developing those performance metrics, they collaborated with end users, with requirements generators, essentially the internal customers for whatever the folks were buying, right? So they can collaborate with them when they were developing those metrics. And then third, they always emphasized 4 outcome-oriented metrics. Now, this is important. These metrics measured the final result of the procurements. So they focused on quality of deliverables. Was that final deliverable really what the requiring entity wanted? The timeliness of those deliveries. Did they get it when they wanted it, when they needed it? They focused on end user satisfaction. So those requirements generators, just how did they feel about how the whole process went? Were they happy with it? Were they responsive? Those kinds of things. And then finally, did they get a good deal? Did it cost more or less than they were expecting going into it? Right. So those are the big practices that we found were common across those companies. And then we took those practices and talked to the senior procurement leaders at 6 federal agencies, the 3 military departments, Air Force, Army, and Navy, and then the Departments of Homeland Security, Veterans Affairs, and NASA. And we talked to them about how they went about their business. And good news, that first practice They all adhered to it, right? So they all had clear linkage between the performance metrics for their subordinate organizations and their overarching mission goals. So that was great. Unfortunately, when it came to the collaboration with end users, requirements generators, internal customers on performance metrics, the only agency we saw doing that was NASA. And they actually started doing it over the course of our audit when we shared some of our earlier observations about what we'd seen in industry. So, but kudos to them. They were very responsive, very quick in taking those insights and implementing them. When it came to the outcome-oriented metrics, it was very much a mixed bag. So across the different agencies, some had plans, some had some efforts in progress, but nobody was implementing all four of these types of outcome-oriented metrics that were really emphasized by the private industry leaders. So that's the report in a nutshell. I'm happy to talk about it some more as we go.
Great synopsis. Ton to unpack there. Tracy, maybe just give us a GSA perspective or layer on, how do you approach this issue, I guess, at your agency?
Well, it's a big question. How, there's a fine line between compliance, which is a lot of times what we tend to latch onto for metrics in the federal government. And, those are things you have to do. You have to be in compliance. You have to follow the rules. But that doesn't necessarily get you to those outcome-based opportunities. So in my office, that's something that we've been looking at quite extensively. And full disclosure, I did not read the GAO report until recently when Nate introduced it to me. So I like to think that we may have been on the same wavelength with GAO, learning, or we heard it from one of the other partners recently. But we are taking a look at how we do things. GSA is the largest office landlord in the country. And one of our biggest challenges right now is transforming our the federal general purpose office portfolio to adapt to this hybrid environment we all find ourselves in. And that's caused us to ask a lot of different questions than I think we would have asked a few years ago. We're asking ourselves things like, how can we understand our portfolio better? Understanding that we provide this service to other federal agencies. So our customers are actually other federal agencies. And, we're saying, what are we going to do now with this hybrid environment? How can we provide services better expediently and at a better value? It's not just faster, cheaper, but we want to be effective and good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. And how can we connect better with our customers? Because there's been a lot of uncertainty over the past few years. And now as we're moving out of the pandemic era into, people starting to return to offices, we have to be open to doing things in new ways and using new technologies and creating acquisitions for a modern world, which is a program that my office runs, where we're looking at what's the outcome. Yes, you can go through all of the steps from the federal acquisition regulation. You can get a contract on the street, but what we really want to know is that contract actually meeting our customers' needs? Is it getting us to what is success? And I think one of the challenges that we have, as we're doing this, is trying to balance between competing, all the priorities that we have, increasing small business, made in America, climate and sustainability. And of course, on top of that, it seems like we never have enough resources. So when we're looking at what we're going to tackle, programs and projects, we have to differentiate between that compliance or things we have to do versus what will move us towards a desired outcome, and design our measures around that. Now, sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't, but what we're looking at is we're going to do the compliance. There's no question about that. So those metrics, they're set. We're going to follow those. what other measures can we get to know that we're actually getting a return on our investment for our time and our energy, as well as the money that we're putting into these programs?
Tracy, I want to go to Lisa with this same question, but before I do, I'm just curious if that's fun for you. You know, people use the phrase federal bureaucracy when they have a critique for government often, but the environment or landscape that you describe right now, this shift over to remote work and, an entire 180 in many cases on assumptions regarding the public building service, strikes me as either fun or terrifying or maybe a little bit of both.
I would probably say it's a little bit of both. It's like being, the first part when we all left our offices in 2020, I think it was like the upward hill of a roller coaster. And now we're getting to that very top of the hill. And soon we're going to be zooming down, which is supposed to be the really fun, makes your heart beat really fast portion of a roller coaster. I personally am not a huge fan of roller coasters, but I am having fun trying to look for ways that we can deliver better to our customers while navigating this new landscape. It's pretty exciting, and you don't always have have opportunities. Federal government bureaucracy, you don't always have those opportunities to chart new waters and really flex those creative skill sets and find ways to meet needs that have completely changed in the past few years.
Lisa, I love having you as part of this discussion because your visibility extends, across a really broad portfolio. Nate mentioned DOD, VA, Department of Homeland Security, NASA. Tracy comes with the GSA perspective, but you work with partners all across the landscape on these procurement and acquisition issues. Maybe what stands out from Nate's synopsis of that report, and how does that tie to, communication?
Absolutely. So I bring a perspective as a long ago small business person. I had a woman-owned HubZone small general contracting business. So admittedly, my perspective, my lane is a little narrow in terms of the construction industry. And that type of contracting, and specifically a type of contracting that leverages unit price data, system called job order contracting, which, by the way, is an excellent example of how the government can be creative and innovative. That is an innovative procurement methodology that actually came out of the DoD and now has expanded far beyond into local government and even private industry. So I bring a somewhat narrow lane of perspective, but also I've been a small business owner. I've also worked for one of the largest construction firms in the country executing this type of IDIQ unit price-based work. And now I work for the company that provides the data, the technology, and the enabling systems for this methodology. And so my lane is narrow, and yet my perspective is broad. And I love everything that's come out of the GAO report. And it really, so much of it resonates with my experience as a small business owner, and now as Gordian, working to enable and support small businesses. I want to point especially to the idea of collaboration. And it starts with the collaboration with internal stakeholders. But it extends to that collaboration with the contractor. So if you don't have the right collaboration at the outset in early acquisition planning, you are not going to end up with the right contractor partner that fuels success in one of these long-term IDIQ programs. But if you get aligned early on with the stakeholder needs, then you end up with the right contractor, and that collaboration really extends throughout the life of the contract and expands to the contractor that is serving you. What's beautiful about these long-term IDIQ programs like job order contracting is that it is very, very supportive of small and disadvantaged business in alignment with the current administration priorities. It allows small construction companies to execute multiple projects over a long period of time with one winning bid, essentially. And so it allows them to turn their attention to execution, embracing the agency's mission as their own, really almost embedded as an extension of staff, aligned with the agency mission. And it supports the growth of that small business over time because it allows them to build capacity and focus on execution rather than on a bidding cycle. So I think that that really the focus on mission and the focus on collaboration is what most resonated with me. And obviously for Gordian, it's the enabling data and technology tools that facilitate that collaboration, but also the wraparound support for the small businesses, and doing all of that in a way that is performance-based or consumption-based, so that it reduces the capital and cash flow demands on a small business.
I want to come back to the cash flow aspect a little later in our conversation, Lisa. I think that's important. Audience, if you're joining us just a few minutes late, I am hosting in this Modernizing Agency Operations Key Areas for Success program, Tracy Marcinowski. She's Assistant Commissioner for Acquisitions at the Public Building Service inside GSA. Nate Tronquil, he's Assistant Director at the Government Accountability Office, and Lisa Cooley, Vice President of Federal at Gordian. Nate, I want to come back to you and ask a question about those companies. You mentioned 7 Fortune 100 companies. What are some similarities that they bear to government agencies? What are some differences between those companies and government agencies? You know, I would imagine size is one reason why you looked at those 7, just because of the massive size of government and the procurement reach contained therein, but I could be reading that wrong.
Yeah, no, absolutely, George. I mean, we definitely wanted to target very large companies that could at least come somewhat close to the size of some of these large federal agencies that we included in our scope, even if they couldn't totally get there in terms of spending annually or workforce. I'll tell you the biggest difference is something Tracy was just talking about, which is all the regs and statutes that that federal procurement folks have to adhere to, right? That is something they just don't have to deal with in the private sector. And you know, it's one less thing that they have to worry about. But beyond that, you know, both in the private sector and in federal agencies, everybody wants to get good value for their money, right? I mean, that's, you know, in private sector, you think about it in terms of profit margins and things like that. But in federal agencies, we think about in terms of being good custodians of taxpayer dollars, right? So getting the good value is still very important. And then, you know, just satisfying those internal customer needs, right? I mean, so the procurement function, whether it's in a federal agency or in private industry, is very much supporting the execution of the mission, trying to work with others, try to enable their activities. And so there are a lot of similarities there that allowed us to make those comparisons in a way that we felt was fair and meaningful.
What about some of the differences?
So the statutes and the regulations, I mean, definitely are amongst the biggest, right? So I think about small business utilization, right? Lisa was talking about small business a moment ago. You know, that along with other socioeconomic goals, you know, that drives a lot of the metrics, as Tracy was saying earlier, right? We're measuring compliance, right? We're measuring that. We're making sure we're not violating the law. We're making sure we're executing in accordance with OMB direction, whatever that might be. And so those, you know, having to work towards those goals and make sure you don't miss them, like Tracy said, right? I mean, you were hitting it, we're complying, right? That takes a lot of energy, a lot of effort. And we recognize that and appreciate that, and we appreciate the importance of those goals. Our main point is that only focusing on compliance with those goals, it's an incomplete picture, right? So it's important, but it's incomplete. And what you measure matters. It frames the conversation, it focuses decision makers, it dictates how we talk about an issue. And so think about this. So contract spending, contract obligations in fiscal year 21 accounted for almost 40% of all discretionary spending across the federal government. That's a ton of money. And that's how we always talk about it, right? We always talk about how much money was spent. It's also a ton of mission, right? And we don't talk about it in terms of mission anywhere near as much as we talk about it in terms of money. And is contracting officers enabling it? Contract leadership setting the tone? Contractors delivering? And because agencies have to focus so much on compliance, I mean, they have to, we think there's some opportunities being missed to really advance the operations at these different agencies, leveraging the procurement function. And I'll just say this, one thing we heard a lot on that job when we talked to different leaders was, hey, GAO, you're asking us to measure stuff that's outside the control of contracting officers. Quality of deliverables, that's the contractor's job, right? The requirements generators, they get the requirement wrong and then they complain about how it turned out. That's not on the contracting officers, right? So we heard that a lot and we recognize it and it's true. But in industry, what we saw is because so much money was going through these shops, they felt that they were in a particularly good position to identify opportunities to improve, identify issues that need to be addressed. So we think there's some opportunities to take some lessons learned from private industry and apply them in the federal space.
Tracy, I was watching you out of the corner of my eye during Nate's response there, and something resonated in his response for you. Could you maybe elaborate for the audience?
No, I could completely empathize and sympathize with Nate's comment regarding, CEOs saying, hey, this is outside my purview, it's outside my control. One thing we talk about a lot, there is all of the responsibility, none of the authority that sometimes procurement and acquisition folks can find themselves in because they aren't the requirements developer, but they are the ones who are going to sign obligating the government for services. So, it's taken, I think it's an evolution within agencies to understand acquisitions and its role. And, it's not just a support function, it's a partnership. Each group brings levels of expertise to the entire agency's delivery of its mission. And in PBS, one thing that when we sat down and we said, okay, we need to look at what we're doing. We need to look at whether or not it's getting us where we need to go. Are we delivering the mission? Are we relying on data, clear, concise data and accurate data to make decisions, or are we basing it on anecdotals? It was not one business line looking at this, it was everybody coming together. One of the biggest things that a program office will say is, well, it's taking too long to deliver the program. And we all point fingers and we all say, oh no, it's acquisition's fault. Nope, it's legal's fault. I put that in so-and-so's mailbox 3 weeks ago. The reality is you have to look holistically at the entire process, from the time that somebody says, hey, I need X, to the time that X is delivered, and whether or not what you ordered actually gave your customer what they needed. Were they able to deliver their mission? Did they, and in terms of PBS, did they have a, safe and healthy workplace to complete their mission? So we actually started the conversation less from the program office on how we would collaborate on metrics to determine whether or not procurements were helping us to deliver our mission, so much as starting that conversation in acquisitions. So, great, you awarded a wonderful contract. But like Lisa said, collaboration even with our industry partners is very important, because you can award the most compliant and regulation beautiful contract and still not deliver your mission. Conversely, and thankfully we try to avoid this, you could deliver a very non-compliant contract and actually get your mission delivered. So it's a balancing act, and that's where we're looking at measures right now, feeding it up that acquisitions is the entire process. It's not just the CO who's responsible, it's everybody. And we need to work together to determine whether or not what we're requiring, buying, delivering, if it all matches to meet our customers' needs.
I love that, Tracy. And I think from our perspective, I have such respect for contracting officers, because most of them are expected to buy across a very broad range of products and services. And it's very difficult to be an expert in all of those things. And we see this with job order contracting. A construction requirements, package will land in the lap of somebody that is an expert in procurement that may not be an expert in construction methodologies or systems or the underlying cost data, which is fairly complex, that underlies a system like job order contracting. And it's one of the reasons we look at the wraparound support of the contractor, the small disadvantaged business once awarded, but we also look at that wraparound support of the contracting staff and endeavor to be a really kind of a subject matter expert to help advise on the solicitation language, especially as it relates to industry specific requirements, and why we really see job order contracting as a holistic system that provides that wraparound support for contracting as well as the small business.
Lisa, if I could stay with you for 1 second to, Tracy mentioned looking holistically at procurements. And in your earlier remarks, you talked about, your background in IDIQ, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity. Like, to me, an outsider to procurement, the length of looking at holistic procurements would seem to be somewhat of a daunting task. Like, as you step back, you advise agencies and organizations on potential pitfalls in that potentially indefinite life cycle. Like, what do you look for? Where do they start? What's step 1, 2, 3?
Yeah, and of course, indefinite doesn't really mean indefinite in the federal government. It means a base year plus, probably 4 option years is generally the indefinite runway. But absolutely, and again, it's where that integrated system can bring real value to the contracting office, to the end user, to the contractor. Otherwise, you have people that are not experts in the data or the technology or the system trying to cobble it together with kind of commercial off-the-shelf offerings. So that idea of a turnkey system that supports all users, all stakeholders in unique ways, but then really the enabling factor in the case of job order contracting is the cost data and the technology tools that support that collaboration, and making sure that all of that is part of an integrated system instead of I've got to go find my data, I've got to figure out the technology. Now, how do I develop the solicitation language around that? What support is needed for the small businesses? It's about being able to procure an acquisition system, kind of a purpose-built and fairly product or service specific acquisition system that supports all stakeholders.
Hey, let's switch gears a little bit to budget and analysis. You look all across government as well. You kind of get in there and get to tinker with the numbers at some of these organizations. What are some common mistakes they make regarding the financial component of acquisition?
That was for me, George?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So, again, just thinking back to the report we were discussing earlier, talking about metrics, right? When you think about the financial aspect of acquisition, the primary metric that comes to my mind that we see applied across federal agencies is cost to spend ratio, right? And so this is, in the past, it's been mandated by OMB. I'm not sure if it is at this point in time. But basically it's saying, what am I paying for my contracting shop? How does that compare to the amount I'm obligating out of that shop, right? With the idea being, I think the generic idea being that the lower that ratio is, the better the deal is you're getting for your contracting office. It's not totally clear to me, to tell you the truth, right? Because I think it's a rather, it's an input. It's an input to consider, but for us and what we've seen is that just focusing on that's not going to give you a complete picture of how your contracting shop is functioning. Some contracts are much more complex than others, right? Sole source versus competitive, different pricing models. And that's why we think that having a well-rounded set of metrics going to account for those outcomes, in addition to just how much you're spending on your contracting shop, can give you a much better picture of how well that shop's really doing for you, for your agency, for your internal customers.
As I look in your report, cost to spend ratio is defined as contracting program costs like salary, training, supplies, divided by total procurement obligations. That's one measure of efficiency. You point to another in that report, Nate, and that's spend under management, or obligations on contracts that meet certain criteria. Could you give a little bit more on that for the audience as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Spend under management is a term of art under OMB's government-wide category management initiative. And actually, some of the things Lisa was talking about earlier made me think of category management, in particular, vendor engagement. That's a key principle of category management. Demand management, understanding, internally what kind of demand you've got from your internal customers. But for the audience, at its heart, and this is a gross oversimplification, category management is buying in bulk. I mean, it's basically the Costco approach for the federal government, right? So the idea is to have fewer, larger contracts that have good prices negotiated and good terms for the government, and have lots of different agencies jump on board to meet lots of need. It's saved the federal government upwards of $50 billion over the last few years. OMB's got a very complex methodology for how they calculate that, either cost savings or cost reduction. We've tested it. We've tested the reliability of it. I can tell you, we think it's a good number. So it's saved the government a ton of money. All right. So very effective in that regard. That said, most small business owners or small business advocates that are familiar with category management have major reservations. And the biggest one is, hey, you're talking about having fewer, bigger contracts. We're not built to scale up to serve 24 CFO Act agencies, right? I mean, a small business is going to be very concerned that it can compete in that area. To OMB's credit, OMB was aware of this when they introduced the initiative. They set some utilization goals there for category management, actually higher than the government-wide utilization goals. 30% of spending supposed to go to small businesses instead of 23%. So that was good. They put some language out there saying that anything you do with category management needs to be consistent with socioeconomic efforts. So that was good. But I'll tell you, last December, the Biden administration issued a memo. I believe it's called Advancing Equity in Procurement, I believe is the name of it. And it touches on category management and tries to make it even more clear that it is not supposed to be executed at the expense of small businesses. So it's a small tweak in language, right? But previously it said category management should be consistent with small business goals. Now it says small business goals should be prioritized over category management. So this is the guidance coming down to agency leadership from OMB. Small Business Administration has a voice, a seat at the table at the Category Management Leadership Council. And then also, it gets kind of into some technical inside baseball, but they changed the way they score category management, basically giving full credit for a lot of small businesses. So to the Biden administration's credit, they've been very mindful of that and thoughtful about it. And it's been an effort they've made to to round out the category management initiative.
We love inside baseball here, Nate, so don't you worry about it. Tracy, I've talked with one of your colleagues over at GSA in the past about category management. Laura Stanton, she's Assistant Commissioner for the Office of IT category, but I'm somewhat ignorant as to how or if category management applies to the public building service. Does it?
So category management does apply to the public building service. I think where it gets a little confusing for people is how it applies. And Nate kind of alluded to this. At its heart, category management is about looking at how you procure things, how you are delivering your missions. It really kind of came out of some of the larger Fortune 500 companies in terms of, it started in the products arena and then shifted to the services arena. So there are categories, for lack of a better term, where category management, the idea of combining procurements to leverage buying power that's not the tenet of category management that you focus on. And PBS is definitely falls under that category in a lot of cases, because what we procure a lot of times are one and done. I would hope that a pipe doesn't break flooding the floor of a building in downtown DC more than once. So I'm not going to be, it's not repeatable work or something I could hold off on repairing until, something breaks at one of the military bases in the area, and we have them done both at the same time. So, but what it does drive us to do is look at how we purchase things. And that's that holistic view and understanding how we tie into the mission and whether or not what we're purchasing is delivering that. So, I'm responsible for the same metrics as the head of our portfolio, the same as the design and construction group, whether or not these projects are done on time, on schedule, on budget. I'm responsible for those as well. But I'm also looking at where I can gain efficiencies. Nate had mentioned the metric that we have on cost to spend ratio. So we don't really, we track it. It's tracked. It's part of the OMB scorecard. But what we're looking at is, okay, so it cost us how much money and resources to put in place a contract? Well, did we meet all of our needs? Did we engage small businesses? Did we give opportunities to small businesses through that contract? Are we using that contract? Did we create something that is not usable by our customers? And if it's not, well, then that's wasted resources. So we try to build that into everything that we're doing so that the products that we're putting out are getting us to those outcome-based metrics.
Lisa, a lot of ground covered there. Anything you want to put stamp or build on regarding category management?
Absolutely. So Nate is talking about a topic, and Tracy are talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is really how do we reconcile category management principles and the need to effectively spend limited taxpayer dollars with also the need to support small and disadvantaged business. And we tend to see those two as polarized, and they don't have to be, because actually, if you can shape the right kind of long-term contracts that consolidate the right kind of spend, smaller task orders that can be tackled by small business, that type of vehicle, IDIQ program, job order contracting is just one example focused on construction, but it can be tremendously supportive of small and disadvantaged business because, again, it allows them to focus on building their business instead of being in a non-value added bidding cycle. And I just want to say that this is not just an altruistic thing. that we need to support small and disadvantaged business. It is the right thing to do for our nation, for supporting mission requirements and for building that defense supplier base, because a lot of the innovation comes out of small businesses. It's critical to our national security that we continue to nurture and develop these small businesses and look at contracting methodologies that can do that. But I personally do not see category management and small and disadvantaged business support as unreconcilable. I think we have to think of a trajectory where we're looking to consolidate some of this spend for greater spending efficiencies, but we're also looking at points of onboard. One of the things that we have seen recently is taking the job order contracting concept and applying it to these little sole source awards. Sometimes they're called mini JOCs or rapid JOCs, job order contracts. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers calls them POCAs, or Performance Oriented Construction Awards. And they are essentially, for small 8A firms, it's a $4.5 million capacity. It's tiny in terms of execution capacity, but it gives them a foothold. It gives them an entry point to build their relationship with an ability to serve federal agencies, and then get ready to compete on larger IDIQ contracts. We have recently worked with Joint Base San Antonio, which has this incredible vision. To start with, they did 3 sole source mini JOC awards, and they're working to really nurture that capability within the local contractor base, with an eye towards a kind of a super JOC. They call it Sabre in the Air Force, a super Sabre that will cover all of Joint Base San Antonio and be a much more competitive and slightly consolidated contract. And so I love that. I love the way that they're thinking of it as a trajectory and a journey on the part of the government, and how building the contractor capabilities, small disadvantaged contractor capabilities, is part and parcel, very much part of that journey.
Lisa, if I could just tag on to that, I just want to say I really appreciate you emphasizing that category management and small business utilization are not at odds with one another, that there are plenty of opportunities for small businesses through category management. And the opportunities you just described, I mean, I feel like that was a very sophisticated understanding of how small business can play, more sophisticated than I often hear. And I think that's been part of the problem in the past. When we went out to different federal agencies and talked to them about category management, went to talk to different small business advocates, frankly, there was a lot of misunderstanding about how small businesses could play under category management. So we actually made some recommendations to some of Tracy's colleagues there at GSA with the Category Management Program Management Office. I will say they have been great to work with, very responsive, and some of my favorite people in the federal government. And they've put out some really good training for small business advocates across the federal government, getting them more familiar with the types of opportunities Lisa's discussing. And also they've updated the web page on the Acquisition Gateway. So there's a dedicated landing page there for small businesses to learn about their opportunities to play under category management and to take advantage of these opportunities that OMB's very deliberatively laid out for small businesses to engage under category management. So just wanted to tag on to that point, Lisa.
Love it. Tracy, we're getting close to the close of our program here, and I want to talk a little bit about a topic that Nate raised earlier as well, and that's metrics. You know, you mentioned this creating acquisitions for a modern world. You're simultaneously plotting GSA's public building services hybrid work-oriented future. Like, that's a lot. What do you look at for metrics? How are you going to measure success in a few years?
Well, if you ask me in a few months, I might have a better answer. But right now, what we're doing is we're working with our customers, internal and external, to understand what the workplace of the future is going to look like. It's a little hard to define. I'm a huge believer that if you're going to develop a measure, before you can't jump to the solution. You got to identify what the problem is that you're trying to solve, then figure out how to solve it. And then you can create the metric to determine whether or not you're actually solving that problem. So, we need to understand where agencies are going to go with their real estate, helping them to understand what they're going to need before we say, well, if we measure this is going to mean success. First, we have to identify what the problem is, what's going to be successful to us and to our customers, and then we can identify the metric. One piece of advice I would give everyone is, as you're looking at shifting towards outcome-based metrics, you don't have to ignore your compliance metrics. In fact, I would say you need to really, really understand what your compliance metrics are, their role in managing risk in your organization. You just can't rely on them solely to tell you if you're successful in your mission execution. And when acquisition is trying to develop metrics to determine how successful they are in supporting an agency's mission, they need to look beyond their how long did it take to award the contract? Was it competed? Did you provide opportunities for small business? All of these things have to happen, but at the same time, look at what was the customer satisfaction survey? What did your customer think was success? Were they able to deliver their mission? Or, were our friends over in, GAO looking at their program saying, hey, you have this beautiful building, but you're not delivering your mission. So really and truly, and don't be afraid of adding new metrics as long as you have an idea of what success is. Don't just measure to measure. Measure something because you know where you're trying to go. And don't be afraid to let go. If you start a program, especially in resource constraint times, and it is not getting you to that path, that's the time to make a shift and try something new. And that's one of the nice things about creating acquisitions in a modern world, when there's a lot of uncertainty, but it gives you a lot of opportunity to be creative and try some new things.
All right, Nate, let's help this audience teach to the test, if you will. If you could wave a magic wand, walk into an agency, be studying, their federal contracting setup, and they just had, a manila folder ready for you, or maybe in some cases, a filing cabinet, I'm guessing, that had everything that you wanted, all the information, all the data, all the metrics. What is some common stuff that you would have in there?
Sure. Well, if they had a filing cabinet, I'd ask them to winnow that down to what's really important instead of trying to herd every cat that's out there for first step. For me, it really goes back to those outcome-oriented metrics. And, at the industry, at the different companies we looked at, they simplified it. They have a dashboard they had going across their different buying offices. They'd only have a few. That said, I just want to emphasize how much I agree with what Tracy just said. You cannot ignore the compliance, obviously. That's first and foremost what needs to get done. But we're really talking about, with our findings, with our recommendations, having just a more balanced set there so you get that holistic perspective. And we got recommendations on the street to all 6 of those agencies we reviewed to adopt those outcome-oriented metrics and to start using them. And if I could wave a magic wand, I would help them figure out how exactly to do it and how to set it up in a way that makes sense, to Tracy's point, so they're measuring the right thing. And then start looking at what the results are there. Because I personally, and I'm biased because I look at contracting a lot, I personally feel like it is a function that's underappreciated. And I think it's because most folks talk about it in terms of number of contract actions, how long it took to get the contract awarded. And they're not talking about outcomes that advance the mission. So if we could advance, augment the conversation through the use of those outcome-oriented metrics, I think that would be really great. And we'd see some opportunities to really improve how federal agencies execute their operations.
Tie a bow on this for us, Lisa. What did we miss?
We probably talked a little bit less about the budgetary control. We talked about the cost, spend to acquisition ratio, but there's also the budgetary component of what the government is buying. How does the government know that it's getting a fair price? And especially if you're talking about small business awards or sole source awards, how do you ensure that when there is more constrained competition that the government is still getting the best deal? And I think we can really point to independent sources of cost data, whether the type of construction cost data that Gordian produces or other types of independent cost analysis and data across a wide variety of industries. That data can really be leveraged to ensure that in the small business support environment, contracting environment, you can strike that magic balance between supporting small business but making sure that the government is also getting a fair and reasonable price. And then on the KPIs, on really the metrics, the technology enablement of those metrics. How do you track those metrics over time, and how do you track them at really a micro level across a multi-year contract at a task order level? And how do you track those KPIs from the perspective of the government's mission and fulfilling the government's mission, but also the small business support, how we are supporting the small business and the budgetary control. And I think technology enablement is really critical to that.
Lisa, Tracy, Nate, thanks so much for being here. Really great conversation.
Thank you, George.
So much, George.
Big thanks to Gordian for making events like this one possible. And thank you, our audience, for tuning in. I hope this program will help you modernize some operations at your agency and identify key areas for success. Keep that learning going. We've got great assets for you in our resource section of this events platform. It's right up there to the top right. GAO's Procurement Report 21-491. We talked about it a few times here today, as well as a new report from Gordian and GovExec entitled Adapting Government Procurement Strategies, Leveraging Small Business and Innovative Procurement Methods. Great reading there. Keep an eye on govexec.com for continued coverage of this important issue. Until next time, I'm George Jackson. Have a great day.